I hadn't really planned to be here to welcome you a second week in a row, but a lot has happened since we've been together. So welcome back to week 2 of Howard Thurman, Moral Anchor to the Movement. And before we launch into that, I just want to acknowledge how much has happened this week. I know we're all watching the state of war that's unfolding and escalating between Israel and Palestine. And we are at a moment that brings real challenges for interreligious encounter. So while ICJS is a dialogical organization, we know that not everyone sees this as a dialogical moment. And yet it is moments like this that most require us to dialogue, not always to find agreement, but to hear each other. At ICJS, dialogue is one of our 5 guiding values. And I'd like to read to you our articulation of what dialogue means to us. And I'm going to put that in the chat for you as well, so you can see what I have to say here. So at ICJS, we say that dialogue invites us to bring our commitments to each conversation and calls for patience, humility, curiosity, and courage. The outcome of dialogue does not require agreement, and meaningful relationships can exist even where there are irreconcilable differences. We believe that dialogue around religious difference deepens understanding and is an essential tool for connecting communities. Yesterday, ICJS released a statement, and we're going to put the link for that in the chat in a moment, or there it is right now, you can see. You may have received it by email. It's also on our website. Please read it. Feel free to communicate with us your own thoughts if you wish. I know that feelings about the violence is raw. The situation is ongoing, and many of us are still struggling. It may be too soon for dialogue at this moment. So this evening, I simply ask that we all pause for a moment of silence in memory of all those who have lost their lives in the last few days, wherever that may have occurred. Thank you. I'm now going to hand the screen back over to Fatima, and hope you'll be inspired to do good in the world by what you hear from her next.
Thank you, Melissa, and welcome back, everyone. I am so happy to be here with you again this evening. So, so let's get back to class 2. All right, thanks. So today is class 2, Howard Thurman, Moral Anchor to the Civil Rights Movement. And for anyone who is new this week, I am Fatima Fanusi, and I'll quickly go over the course goals and the outline. The outline is on the right-hand side of the screen. And on the left-hand side of the screen, we have the goals. The goals for this class are to introduce Howard Thurman and place him in historical context, to illustrate his influence on the American Civil Rights Movement, which we'll be looking at today, and then finally to highlight his impact on American Christianity. So our objective for today is to understand how Howard Thurman's tenure at Howard University, his friendship tour of India, and the pivotal meeting with Mahatma Gandhi helped to combine to help Thurman to shape a new approach for a generation of civil rights movement leaders and activists. And then also to understand Thurman as part of the trio. And for those of you who were here last week, you remember me mentioning Mordecai Johnson and Benjamin Mays, and Howard Thurman is the 3rd member of this trio of church reformers who were intent upon revising the social gospel for African Americans and for American Christianity. And for African Americans, what I mean by this is, if you remember us talking about the spirituals and Thurman fashioning himself as a religious spokesperson for those with their backs against the wall. Now we're going to see Thurman, especially at Howard University and upon his return from India, really making an effort to reform the church, to bring African American worship, out of the current out of the kind of pie in the sky, and bring it back down to the earth. So exactly what he was doing for the spirituals. And Thurman will be bringing this same approach to the Black church and to a new generation of leaders. At the same time, Thurman will be minimizing the distinction between the secular and the sacred, and helping folks to understand that there's the same God of the church that we have in the church is the same God of society. And again, we can look at Thurman's life before this moment, especially his early encounters with the church, where he did not see God in the interactions he had in Daytona Beach after his father died. And we can look at his experimental work when he was a pastor in Oberlin, Ohio, and that effort he made to really bring God back into the church, to rescue Christianity from, the religion of Jesus Christ from what American Christianity had become. So these are going to be some of Thurman's goals. And these years while he is at Howard are also the years where he's really the formation of Howard Thurman as a thinker is really maturing, and we see this in his mentoring of an entire generation of civil rights leaders. Now, before we get into Howard at Thurman, when we closed off last week, Katie Thurman, Howard's first wife, had died of tuberculosis in December of 1930. And he knew Sue Bailey. He had known Sue Bailey. He and Katie had both known her. She was a graduate of Spelman College, and she was also active in the national YWCA movement. And Sue Bailey basically was at a breakfast with, she was at a YMCA event with Thurman, and they got to talking, and at some point Thurman invited Sue for further discussion about the leadership role she played to his house for breakfast. And Sue reported back years later that when she walked into Thurman's house, Howard's house, his shutters were all drawn, and she opened the shutters, I guess both literally and metaphorically, letting the light back into his life after that 2-year period of mourning. And Sue would go on to, Sue was a musician, she was a scholar activist, and together the two would form a dynamic power couple. And Sue Bailey Thurman was certainly Howard Thurman's partner and right hand for the duration of his life in all of his works, and standing on her own. Just to take a few moments to go briefly into her background, she was born in August of 1903 to the Reverend Isaac Bailey and Susie Ford Bailey. Her parents were educators in Arkansas, and she had a grandparent who was a member of the Arkansas legislature during Reconstruction. And her parents also founded the Southeast Baptist Academy, which was the school for African-American children in Thurman, Arkansas, where they grew up. Sue Bailey was also a musician. She graduated from Spelman Teachers College in 1921 and Oberlin in 1926 with a BA in music and liberal arts. And then she also taught music at Hampton Institute. And in addition to teaching music at Hampton, she was responsible for the music curriculum for African-American secondary schools and colleges and universities throughout the country, or throughout the American South. Sue also went on to become the YWCA National Secretary. And as I mentioned, she'll accompany Thurman on the tour for India, and she was in her own right a very powerful woman. She had a close relationship with Mary McLeod Bethune, who we discussed last week, and she was also the first editor for the Negro Women's Journal, which was a journal of Bethune's Negro Women's Council. Sue Bailey's grandmother, Elvie, was born into slavery in Mississippi, and she was made a concubine by their owner. And her grandfather, Perry Bailey, most of you are, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with Frederick Douglass, whose name before he ran away to become free was actually Bailey. And Sue's grandfather, Perry Bailey, was a relative of Frederick Douglass. So we see this continuing trajectory of people bringing themselves up directly from slavery, and Howard Thurman, his wife, his partner for life, his entire generation was coming out of this milieu. In 1932, at Kings Mountain in North Carolina, following a joint YMCA and YWCA conference, Howard and Sue were married. And this was the same Kings Mountain where Thurman had initially met Mordecai Johnson and penned his letter that we all went over last week, "My People Need Me." So this was a significant place for him, and that's where the two wed. After this, both Howard and Sue traveled to Washington, D.C., where Howard Thurman accepted a position in the School of Divinity, the School of Religion at Howard. So according to one of Thurman's students, the early 1930s was a time, and this is a quote, before religion occupied a central role in the Black struggle and before religious thinkers became intellectually respectable among the austere ranks of the Black scholar. And so we talked about this a little bit last week when we discussed the spirituals and how Thurman really worked to bring respectability back to them and to help emphasize the spirituality of the enslaved and the importance of the message that they were bringing for themselves as African Americans, as people in bonds, and also for Americans and American Christians generally. And so in that same vein, Thurman, along with Mordecai Johnson and Benjamin Mays, will work to reestablish religion as a central place in the lives of African-American intellectuals and scholars, and in the work that they're doing to achieve freedom and liberation for African-Americans. So now we begin Howard's, yes, and if anyone has questions, I forgot to mention that, you can just drop them into the chat and hopefully I will see them. So Howard University, the capstone of Negro education. Thurman is invited to Howard by his mentor and friend, Mordecai Wyatt Johnson, who he met when as a professor of economics at Morehouse. And now Mordecai is president of Howard University, and he is intent on making Howard University the top educational institution in the country for African Americans. He invites Thurman to join the School of Religion. And in the fall of 1932, Thurman begins his tenure at the School of Religion as a professor of religion and the dean of chapel. Now, the dean of chapel itself was a relatively new role on college campuses in the United States. As a matter of fact, the only other colleges that had this role at the time was the University of Chicago and Princeton University. And Thurman was close friends with the dean of chapel at the University of Chicago, and this may have been one reason why he worked to bring that same position to Howard University. And Mordecai Wyatt Johnson, a few years later, will bring Benjamin Mays from Morehouse to the School of Religion as the dean of the School of Religion. So now we have the three, Mordecai Johnson, Benjamin Mays, and Howard Thurman, all at Howard University at the same time, as it is indeed becoming the capstone of Negro education. In 1939, the School of Religion, the hard work pays off, and the School of Religion is actually accredited by the AATS. And the three work to implement a rigorous modernist curriculum. So that same curriculum that Thurman benefited from, along with Johnson and Mays at Rochester Theological School or Harvard or the University of Chicago, depending on which you're talking about. They were working now to implement this into the School of Religion at Howard. Thurman's colleagues at Howard University at this time included E. Franklin Frazier, Rolf Bunch, Abram Harris, and others who demonstrated the wide gulf between African-American intellectuals and African-American religion at the time. Now, I want to say a few words about Benjamin Mays before we move on. Benjamin Mays authored during the 30s, while Thurman was there, he authored two books, one called The Negro's Church, which was published in 1933, and the other called The Negro's God, which was published in 1938. And what's important about these books for our purposes is that they were critiquing the traditional Black church, and both would be viewed as, quote, defining texts of Black theological modernism. So what's happening here is I'd like to just share a brief quote with you from the Negro Church, written by Benjamin Mays, where Benjamin Mays says that it revealed that the status of the Negro Church, I'm sorry, this is written about Benjamin's book. The Negro Church revealed that the status of the Negro Church is in part the result of the failure of American Christianity in the realm of race relations, that the church's program, except in rare instances, is static, non-progressive, and fails to challenge the loyalty of many of the most critically minded Negroes, that the vast majority of its pastors are poorly trained theologically, that more than half of the sermons analyzed are abstract and imbued with a magical conception of religion, that in church schools, less than 1/10 of the teachers are college graduates. So here you can see that Benjamin Mays' research is showing that the unsatisfactory nature of African-American Christianity at this time. So when I talk about those goals at the beginning of the class of being able to understand that the role of Thurman and Mays and Johnson's in revising the social gospel for African Americans and reforming the Black church and American Christianity writ large, this is an example of what it was that they were unhappy with within the African American church. And Thurman has a 1940 essay called The Negro in the City that was actually published under the title A Native Son Speaks, where he advances ideas like interracial cooperation, integration, and other things as being critical to reformation of the church and American Christianity, along with making that distinction between the religion that Jesus brought as an oppressed Palestinian Jew and American Christianity as it had developed in America. So these are things that Thurman and Mays and Johnson would be intent upon working to transform in over the next few decades. And then finally, Thurman's biographer says, what united Thurman's two roles at Howard, and remember the two roles I'm talking about are being a professor of theology of religion and then also dean of the chapel, was an effort to overcome the widespread perception held by many leading Black intellectuals that religion was at best irrelevant to the struggle for Black equality, if not a positive hindrance. So that notion that religion, and you can see this in the thinking of E. Franklin Frazier and others, but that notion that religion was irrelevant or had nothing to offer in the struggle for equality and freedom and liberation in America is something that these three men would be working to overturn. So how did Thurman affect both his students and the development of Christian thought within Afro-America? So one of the best ways to look at this is to look at what he was actually doing in the classroom. And here in the classroom, we can understand Thurman as both spiritual mentor and guide, even as he was professor and teacher. So first, I just want to talk about Thurman's title for a second, because this helps us to understand who Thurman was, who he's evolving to be. So he wanted his formal title at Howard to be professor of history and professor of religion. His formal title was actually professor of theology. He petitioned both Mordecai Johnson and Benjamin Mays to change this title, but he was denied the opportunity to do this. And I think it's important to understand that he would prefer to be a professor of history and the philosophy of religion as opposed to a theologian. He did not consider himself a theologian. But Thurman was, by all accounts, as we can imagine, considered a remarkable teacher by his students. And in a few seconds, I will let the students speak for themselves. Thurman basically used the classroom. I think about it as a laboratory for students to look within themselves and to connect with their own thoughts and their own personal religious experiences. And that's why I have on the screen that he was a guide in the classroom. And what I'd like to do right now is just share the words, the recollections of one of Thurman's students, as I feel that it does a much better job than I could do of kind of illustrating for you how Thurman was teaching. So this student says, when this extraordinary man walked into social ethics class, a silence born of awe reigned. It always seemed as if we had dragged him away from private meditation. He would look over the heads of those in class into space for what seemed minutes. Then he would open up in his slow, laborious manner with a provocative thesis, such as, when you young preachers fulminate about what you should do in any given situation, remember one thing: we are what we do in spite of reservations. He would wait for a response. My hand was usually up first with a question. Dr. Thurman, are you saying that if a soldier kills the enemy, he is a murderer, or at least a killer? Or if one accepts an assigned status of inferiority, let us say, sits in the balcony of a Jim Crow theater, he is inferior? Thurman would say, ah, and recognize one of the several hands now held aloft. We would leave the class with no answers, but many intriguing questions that had not occurred to us before. It was Thurman's belief that answers must come from within, from the bit of God in each of us. And that was a quote by James Farmer, who was one of Thurman's students, and he wrote this in his autobiography. So Thurman is guiding and leading his students in the classroom. And then, of course, he is combining biblical criticism and the social gospel with his own unique brand of spirituality to create an attractive alternative to the traditional and literal Christianity or biblical Christianity that African American intellectuals and students were increasingly rejecting. And so many African American Christians, of course, had been steeped in traditional and liberal reading of the Bible. And many divinity students talked about having their faith shaken after encountering Thurman's modernist approach to Christianity. Thurman also, in his capacity as dean of the chapel, reached out to not just his students, not just staff, not just faculty, but also the wider community, African-American community surrounding Howard University. And Rankin Chapel became a very vibrant institution within the community. And in this way, he was able, especially with so many intellectuals in attendance, Thurman was able to minister and outreach to skeptics, to mockers, and to the uninterested, those who simply were uninterested in religion. And often you have many of them testifying later in life how Thurman was able to reach or awaken them to the centrality or importance or even benefit or efficacy of religion after they had ceased to see it in such a light. Thurman reached some through his eloquence and through his careful use of English language, including poets and artists. Ralph Ellison, the writer, included a sermon written by Howard Thurman or given by Howard Thurman as an example of, quote, how elegance turns up in every aspect of Afro-American culture. And according to one student, Professor Thurman helped her and her father to realize that Christianity alone was not the only way to respond religiously. So that tension that we always saw in Thurman from the time that he was a boy with organized religion or institutional Christianity was, we see him maturing in his role as a Christian minister, but we also see that it's allowing for an expansion of what is religious. And this is something that he passes on and shares with his students. So through new approaches to both biblical criticism and new ideas of social justice, Thurman convinced this skeptical student who I'm mentioning, as well as her agnostic father, that Christianity could be both an intellectual and respectable faith. And so the pews of Rankin Chapel under Thurman flowed with regulars from throughout the community, from throughout the university community and beyond. And this is just one example of what Thurman was like and how he was both spiritual mentor and guide, as well as professor within and outside of the classroom. And here's a picture of Thurman on Howard's campus in the 30s. This is Thurman in kind of like one person left of the center, right of the center. And yes. And so now we come to our first engagement strategy. Thurman was, he delivered his first published sermon, or his first sermon that would be published, at Plymouth Congregational Church in Washington, D.C. And the title of the sermon was Barren or Fruitful. The sermon was based upon Jeremiah 17. And Thurman also delivered this same sermon in 1927 at United Church in Oberlin, Ohio, and in 1928 at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York. So I'd like to call on any volunteer from the audience right now. I think I have to bring you all back so I can see you, to read for us the next quote. All right, I can't see you all, so if we have a volunteer, you can just unmute yourself and read.
I can read. It's
Thank you.
Alicia.
Okay.
Yep. First, a curse on him who relies on man, who depends upon mere human aid. For he is like a desert scrub that never thrives, set in a solitary place in the steppes, a striking picture. A certain kind of man likened unto a desert scrub, undeveloped and underdeveloped, undernourished and emaciated, stubby and stunted, acting on the theory that to breathe is to live. What a character analysis. He is thus saith Jeremiah, because he relies on man. He has a false sense of security. When such a man wants to convince himself that he is somebody, his appeal most often is to those things that are of temporary and passing significance.
Do we have another volunteer? Or Alicia, you can continue.
In the first place, there are those who appeal to family connections and social position. There are others who appeal to their training, their education. And then there are those who appeal to the peculiar quality of their righteousness. They are, I thank God I am pure, people.
You may continue.
Is your life barren? When you are most yourself, do you know yourself to be a desert scrub, a spiritual, undernourished, and moral, emaciated individual, narrow, selfish, puny-souled, bigoted, living under a false sense of security?
Thank you. And so this is an excerpt from Is Your Life Barren? And in the same sermon, he's also asking the question of, or is your life fruitful? And if I could get one volunteer to read these two passages, please just unmute yourself and feel free to read.
The second picture is most inspiring. The prophet pictures the man who depends upon God, who has God for his confidence, as a tree planted beside a stream, sending its roots down to the water. He has no fear of scorching heat. His leaves are always green. He goes on bearing fruit when all around him is barren and lives serene. In other words, such a man looks out on life with quiet eyes. Your fundamental security then is not family, training, piety, or the like, but rather the supreme quality of your dedication to the highest there is in life, God. To say, I affirm my faith in God with my total personality is one of the supreme affirmations of the human spirit.
The real atheist is not necessarily the man who denies the existence of God, but rather the man who, day after day and week after week, subscribes to a faith in God with his lips while acting on the vital assumption that there is not God.
Thank you. And then we have one last quote from the excerpt from this sermon. And if I could have one last reader round us out with this last.
There are three things that make my faith in God teaches me about God. In the first place, it teaches me that God is. Again, my faith teaches me that God is near. The final thing that my faith teaches me is that God is love. Not only that, he is. Not only that he is near, but that he is love. When a man dedicates his life to God, he begins at once to fulfill in his own experience the practical logic of that dedication. It is here that he finds a true basis for security.
Thank you. So now I'd like everyone to take, I'd say about, it's 7:04, 2 minutes to 1 minute to actually just sit and reflect, to think. And then the second minute to just in the chat, answer the question, in what do you find your security? So Thurman, we ended this passage with Thurman talking about a man dedicating his life to God and finding a true basis for security. And I'd like everyone to take a minute or two to reflect on that question and to drop their answer in the chat. And we'll, come back at 7:07. Okay, so we have a few things in the chat. We're going to move it ahead, move on. So if you haven't already put something in, that's okay. You can just continue to reflect on that on your own. So now we're going to get into the friendship tour to India, led by Howard Thurman, the Negro delegation, and just the pre-trip. So I want to just take a moment or two to talk about the genesis of this trip, the preparation, the YMCA delegation, and the Indian Christian Global Movement, along with Thurman's role at the beginning of this trip and then in the actual trip itself. And the thing that I'd like everyone to think about as we move through the preparation for the trip and the trip itself, and then Thurman returning to the United States, is how did this trip shape Thurman's thinking and his approach to religion and Christianity in America? So that's something I'd like everyone to keep in the back of their mind. First of all, the trip was conceived of by Reverend A. Rala Ram, who was the executive secretary of the Student Christian Movement of India, Burma, and Ceylon. Ram met Thurman at Spelman College in the fall of 1931 when he was there to give a lecture. And he had an interest in African Americans, especially because of the parallels between their subjugation and that of lower caste groups in India. Also, Thurman and most African Americans were Christian, and this was another interest that he had in them. And so Thurman reached out and wanted to invite an African American group or delegation to come and speak and tour all throughout the country. So African Americans also, in preparation leading up to this trip, they had connections to India in the 19th century and the 20th. And I don't think we'll have time to talk about Julia Derricott, but she was an inspiration for the Negro delegation. And the Thurmans would actually create a scholarship fund in her name upon their return to send African Americans over to India. Now, also Gandhi had written a letter titled To the American Negro, which was published in 1929 in the Crisis magazine. And in the introduction, in introducing Gandhi in this letter, W.E.B. Du Bois introduced Gandhi as, quote, the greatest colored man in the world. So Gandhi and India were definitely in the eyesight of African Americans, especially African American intellectuals. And the tour itself emerged as part of this international global student Christian movement and as part of ongoing efforts against both racism and colonialism. During the winter, in preparation, the group made a careful study of comparative religion, and Thurman reached out to many of his mentors and professors in preparing to go to the trip, both from Rochester Theological School, Haverford, and others. Secondly, they were making a study of historical Christianity, and then finally, Protestantism in America, primarily with reference to minorities in America, and then the relationship between Christianity and capitalism, and the life, career, and teachings of Jesus. This is something that Thurman had become familiar with, of course, as a graduate theological student, but he continued to study in greater detail prior to the trip in preparation. And then, of course, looking at and exploring the history of the British and the Indian. Now, Thurman, it's important to know that initially Thurman wanted no part in this trip. And he was not in agreement with it. And eventually he became convinced that it was a good idea to go. But one of the reasons is he did not want to go overseas to India representing American Christianity, in which, in his words, he had no confidence. Rather, as an underprivileged man, and this is Thurman speaking, he was interested in religion from the point of view of the needs of underprivileged people. So that's the way, that was Thurman's mindset prior to the trip, going into the trip. When he finally is convinced to go, it is indeed under certain conditions, and the conditions are that Thurman is not sent over as a representative of American Christianity. Also, he's not interested in his delegation providing entertainment for Indians or fulfilling any stereotypes or singing or dancing or anything like that. So this is where the trip is prior to actually taking place. And then in 1935, in October of 1935 through March of 1916, Howard Thurman, along with his wife, Sue Bailey Thurman, and another minister named Edward Carroll and his wife, Finola Carroll, would form the delegation to India. Now, this delegation had an exhausting and grueling schedule, and they all spoke and were taxed to the utmost, but no member of the delegation spoke more than Howard Thurman. And I don't know if you can see the map here on the screen, but these arrows indicate where the entire delegation traveled to, where they spoke. And then the smaller little dots are all places that they actually were speaking outside of the arrows. So Thurman spoke in a total of over 250 times in over 50 cities, and he spoke on topics ranging from St. Paul to Booker T. Washington, and to a diverse Indian audience, with listeners including Indians from across religious, ethnic, socioeconomic, political background, and from across class and caste. So the name of the tour is called the Friendship Tour, and this is good news for the underprivileged. Now, I don't have time in this online version of the class to go too in depth to what Thurman was doing in India, but I will pull out a few highlights, and I will talk just briefly on the subjects that Thurman considers taboo and why. And I talked about this in talking about Thurman's preparation for the trip and the original reason he did not want to go. But I'll just elaborate on that a little bit more. And if you remember anything from class 1, you'll see this is definitely in keeping with who Thurman has always been. And if you remember the article that he wrote while he was a student at Rochester Theological School seminary, again, it's in keeping with how he presented himself to the world at that time as well. So Thurman, he didn't want to represent American Christianity, again, because Thurman saw a very clear distinction, and not just distinction, but a deviation from the religion of the Palestinian Jew, Jesus, and American Christianity as it was practiced at this time. he didn't want to be a race man. He didn't want to be considered or a Negro minister or a Negro Christian or a Negro intellectual, but a minister, a Christian, and intellectual. And then, as I mentioned before, he didn't want to sing or dance, and he was really striving to fight stereotypes. At the time of the tour, he found that Joe Louis, that many famous African Americans were really stereotyped and looked at in a way that was really othering them outside of humanity. And that was something that Thurman was fighting all of his life against, and certainly in this tour in India. So who is Thurman coming as, and what does he want to speak on? Thurman is coming as a representative of the religion of Jesus. That is how he styles himself, and the Goodwill Friendship Tour would solidify this for him in a manner that would endure for the remainder of his career. And in addition to the encounters and friendships that he made, particularly with Mahatma Gandhi, Gandhi challenges Thurman to, he asked him point blank, where is the Black man's Gandhi? Thurman also has an encounter with a Ceylon law student that will stay with him. And in a slide or two, we will actually look at Thurman's recollection of this entire exchange. But moving back to Gandhi, Gandhi taught and reinforced for Thurman the importance of the philosophy of nonviolence as a spiritual discipline. And remember, we met Thurman as the mystic, Thurman as the young boy who saw God in nature. So Gandhi's emphasis on the spiritual of on nonviolence as a spiritual discipline really resonated with Thurman. And he resonated with Gandhi more than he did with Rabindranath Tagore. He found Tagore to be aloof, and he was not as he came away not feeling as close to him as he did with Gandhi. So again, as I mentioned, we don't have time to go into detail about this very important tour that took almost the better part of a year of Thurman's life. But I do want to share with you this critical encounter he had with a Ceylon lawyer. And although there are other versions of this encounter, especially written by Thurman in his autobiography, those narratives were decades later. And this narrative, as found in the papers of Howard Thurman, edited by Walter Fluker, was written by Thurman in his journal, not shortly after the incident actually occurred. So Thurman was giving a lecture, and a lawyer came up to him, and basically this is Thurman's immediate recollection of what the lawyer said. And if I could have another volunteer, please read for all of us this encounter with the lawyer. Thurman is writing in shorthand, so where you see the X, that's just shorthand for Christians or Christianity. And whoever is volunteering to read this short passage, it's just this one. You can unmute yourself now and please read.
What are you doing here? This is what I mean.
Sorry.
Okay. Africans were taken to America as slaves by Christians. They were sold in American to other Christians. They were held in slavery for 300 years by Christians. They were freed as a result of economic forces rather than Christian idealism. And I understand that you are lynched in America by Christians. In light of all this, I think that for a young, intelligent Negro such as you to be over here in the interest of a Christian enterprise is for you to be a traitor to all the darker peoples of the earth. Such I consider you to be. Will you please account for yourself and your very unfortunate situation?
Thank you. And so if you remember, this was something Thurman was concerned about before he even left for India. He did not want to be seen as a representative of Christian oppressors and American Christianity as practiced by people who oppressed. And so if I could now have a second volunteer to read Thurman's immediate response to this lawyer written in his journal shortly after the event. Please unmute yourself.
I do not come to bolster up a declining or disgraced Christian faith in your midst. I do not come to make converts of Christianity, nor do I come as Exhibit A as to what Christianity has done for me and my people. I am a Christian because I think that the religion of Jesus, in its true genius, offers me very many ways out of the world's disorders. But I make a careful distinction between Christianity and the religion of Jesus. I am dead against most of the institutional religion with which I am acquainted. I belong to a small minority of Christians who believe their society has to be completely reorganized in a very definite egalitarian sense if life is to be made livable for the most of mankind.
Thank you. And so this challenge by the Sulon lawyer really stays with Thurman, and you'll see him. This is one of the things that he's really responding to in lectures and sermons that he will give in the next few years. And these are ideas that he's already had, but he formulates them in a way that eventually will lead to the publication in the late 40s of Jesus and the Disinherited. But I wanted you all to see for yourselves this challenge that that will really put continue to light a fire that's already within Thurman, and that he'll act upon when he returns to the United States. And then finally, before we move out of India, I have one last passage to share. So whoever's ready to gear up and read this last quote, please just go ahead right now and unmute yourself while I'm introducing it. Thurman, remember, is that boy that we found, the lonely mystic who found God in nature, who sought God in nature and found him. And so we can't leave India without looking at how a natural moment for Thurman, which also helps to convince him that now is the time to move in a definitive way toward what he feels God is calling him to do. And so this is our next slide, and this is the famous Khyber Pass moment. If you've already read Thurman's autobiography, this passage does come from With Head and Heart, his autobiography, then you're familiar with it, or if you've seen the film. But again, we'll read it right here to talk about what Thurman is experiencing as he is moving out of across the country. Could I have whichever volunteer has unmuted themselves to read this passage?
Here was the getaway through which Roman and Mughal conquerors had come in other days, bringing with them goods, new concepts, and the violence of armed might. All that we had seen and felt in India seemed to be brought miraculously into focus. We saw clearly what we must do somehow when we returned to America. We knew that we must test whether a religious fellowship could be developed in America that was capable of cutting across all racial barriers with a carryover into common life, a fellowship that would alter the behavior patterns of those involved. It became imperative now to find out if experiences of spirituality, unity among people could be more compelling than the experiences which divide them.
Thank you. So Thurman will return from India, and what are these lessons that he's learning? So I want to just emphasize two things. One is that Justice Thurman reinterpreted Christianity to radically emphasize and focus upon Jesus as an oppressed non-citizen Palestinian subject of the Roman state. Thurman radically interpreted Gandhi's nonviolence, placing it in a Christian framework, as well as an antidote to the virulent racism crippling Christianity in the context of American racism. And again, I don't mean to imply that Thurman did this on his own. As I mentioned before, Mordecai Johnson and Benjamin Mays are just two individuals who also, since the beginning of the 20th century, have been emphasizing the religion of Jesus as over Christianity as practiced in America. And yes. So here are two pictures of Thurman and Sue Bailey. in the middle, and we also have Edward Carroll and Finola Carroll, and they're just surrounded by Indians who they are visiting with. And yeah, that's all we have time for. So in terms of takeaways from Thurman's trip, this is a quote taken from a letter by Max that Thurman wrote to Max Jurgen shortly after returning. And in it, he says to Max, since we saw you last, we have been to India and we have seen for ourselves. The only thing that I can say in passing is that I did not know what it was to wrestle with hate until my experiences in that country. I may add, I am not thinking of anything directed at me as a person, but the complete futility that is present in the mind when one sees what imperialism truly involves. And the reason I pulled this quote out is because many of Thurman's biographers and some scholars really were a little taken back. You know, how is it that an African-American man growing up in the Jim Crow South, a generation or two removed from slavery, travels to India and doesn't see hate until his experience is there? And I don't know the answer to that question, but the one thing I'd like to emphasize at this point, and this is a takeaway for Thurman's trip from his trip to India, is that he does seem to come back with a renewed hope in America for a few reasons. He sees this democratic ideal, even if it has not been realized. There is this ideal in the Constitution that, you know, men are created equal, and that this is something to work through. And I think this for him is juxtaposed against the caste system and this notion that no, we don't agree on that, even ideally. In addition, I think he sees hope for Christianity itself, because again, you have one religion that the majority, of course not all, but the majority of Americans in the 1930s were Christian. And so again, he sees a real hope and potential for getting it right in America. And then finally, on the right-hand side, I have this quote from Gandhi where he says, "It may be through the Negroes that the unadulterated message of nonviolence will be delivered to the world." And this is the challenge from Gandhi to Thurman that's percolating in his post-India trip thoughts, and will continue to inform both his ideas and his speech. So now once Thurman gets back, and remember, the trip was from 1935 to 1936. Immediately in 1936, when he returns, he sets to work. He's his work is now connecting Afro-America to the spiritual philosophy of nonviolence and what he perceives as the true religion of Jesus. And he also sees the importance of African Americans having their own Gandhi. And immediately upon his return, Mordecai Johnson, Benjamin Mays, and others travel to India. And of course, this further cements African American leaders to both Gandhi and his leadership. And these men are building blocks of the SCLC-led civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. And together, their students will be, both men and women, will truly be the activists and leaders of the civil rights movement. Do I have time for this? Well, we're talking about Thurman's influence on the modern civil rights movement, so I will quickly go through this slide. I'm a little behind, but this is, what I've done here is pull out a few quotes, sections from a letter that Thurman wrote to John Nevin Sayer, who was chairman of the International Fellowship of Reconciliation. And before I get into this, I'll just say a few words about George Shorty Collins. And Shorty was called Shorty because he was a 6'5" European American Baptist minister who served as the Southern Racial and Industrial Secretary for the Fellowship of Reconciliation in the 1920s. And when Thurman first met him, he said that he was really impressed by George Shorty, and he had this to say about him. He said, "In my encounter with FOR, that's the Fellowship of Reconciliation, as exemplified in the life of one of its secretaries, Shorty Collins, I found a place to stand in my own spirit, a place so profoundly affirming that I was strengthened by a sense of immunity to the assaults of the white world of Atlanta, Georgia." And remember, mind you, this is during the 1920s. Some of you may also remember from class 1 that Shorty Collins was also the person that introduced Thurman to all of Schreiner's poetry at a retreat in New York. So Thurman, in the letter, before he gets to these points, discusses Shorty's success in bringing Southern European Americans and African Americans together through the Fellowship of Reconciliation by concentrating on a particular group of Southerners, and those were faculty and students. He also mentions in the same letter one Buck Howard Anderson Kester and his work with a student group, industrial and labor's area. And he cites both of these men, these ministers, as examples to follow for John Sayre in his effort to do work in the South. So his advice is that the fellowship should concentrate its energies in one area, and that it can certainly wish other people doing work towards racial reconciliation in the South well, but that they should confine their efforts to one particular kind of job. His second piece of advice is that when an area is selected, that someone who is especially fitted by background, training, insights, and guts should be commissioned to carry it through. Thirdly, the active interest and support of both Negroes and white people in that section should be solicited and utilized. And then fourthly, Negro and white students and faculties and a few courageous and intelligent ministers of both races should also be enlisted. And then at the end of the letter, he says, you will notice that I do not mention a particular area. And this is truly in keeping with Thurman and who he is and his own thinking that people need to meditate, look within, and listen to the sound that they hear within, the genuine within, to find God and to find their path. So he says, I hesitate to give you any advice because he doesn't want to put forward his ideas over Sayre's. So this is who Thurman was, but the reason I took the time to bring this excerpt of the letter out is because we can see, especially for any of you listening today who are familiar with the modern civil rights movement, we can see some of the strategies are already being outlined here in this letter written in 1936. And now we get to Christian, who calls me Christian. So Thurman was in a way, radically changed and transformed by his time in India. Not that he gained anything new in his insight and his outlook, but he came back after that exchange with that Ceylon lawyer, and after that challenge from Gandhi, and after that very spiritual moment in nature, looking at the Khyber Pass and reflecting on history. He came back convinced that he could no longer be silent and that he had to call American Christians to task for I don't want to say betraying, but to reform the religion that Jesus brought. And so I have a few excerpts from this famous sermon that he would give again and again throughout the country. Christian, who calls me Christian. If I let flower in my own heart what I condemn in society and in my fellow man, Christian, who calls me Christian. And although we're not going to get into Martin Luther King in this class today, I have a picture of him because these are the people he's speaking to at the or who will be influenced by these sermons and lectures that will eventually find themselves in his published writings. And King will be a major recipient of these ideas that are percolating and that he's crisscrossing the nation to share with audiences all over the United States and Canada. So also he has, it's a great creative spiritual act to know when the moment for martyrdom has arrived. And in moments of profound meditation, I become sometimes for one transcendent moment only, a central part of the purpose of my life. And there's so much that I want to say about this, but I'm just going to give you those few quotes, and we're going to move on to this map so that I can discuss how, upon his return from India, Thurman will now actively, physically, literally, metaphorically, be sowing the seeds for the movement. So on the screen, we have a map that, and between 1936 and 1942, and again, just to remind you, Thurman returns from that exhaustive trip where he spoke and gave over 250 speeches in over 50 states across this enormous country of India, the subcontinent. he immediately comes back in 1936 and embarks on this grueling, exhausting tour of North America, both Canada and the United States. And I just want to give you the names of some of the colleges, some of the churches, and some of the organizations that he will speak for in 1936, in 1937, in 1938, 1939, 1940, 41, and 1942. And it would actually, if there's anyone out there who's a graduate student, I actually think it would be a wonderful project for someone to even be able to take a map of the hotspot centers for the civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s, and to put it on top of a map of where Thurman was speaking. I think one would find some interesting results that would lead to some wonderful research on Thurman that has still yet to be written on his role as a moral anchor and as a mentor in the civil rights movement. So Thurman spoke at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. He spoke at North Carolina A&T in Greensboro, North Carolina. And all of these trips are trips that he would make, most of them multiple trips between 36 and 42. He spoke at Alabama State Teachers College in Montgomery, Alabama. He spoke at Georgia State College in Savannah and the University of Chicago, the University of Colorado, St. Louis, Missouri, Knoxville College in Tennessee, Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts, Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York, Penn State, Bryn Mawr College, and Syracuse College, Olivet Baptist Church in Chicago, Wheaton College in Massachusetts. I hope you're keeping up and your eyes are zigzagging across the screen. Bennett College in Greensboro, North Carolina, Colby Junior College in New London, New Hampshire, St. Augustine, Florida, the YMCA convention at First Baptist Church in Roanoke, Virginia, Mexico, United Christian Adult Movement in Manistee Springs, Virginia, Democracy, Religion, and World Change Conference, Colgate Rochester Divinity School, his alma mater in New York, Cornell University, Winona Lake Christian Assembly in Indiana, Broadway Methodist Church in Camden, New Jersey, Kansas, Whittier College in Whittier, California. He led an interracial service at the European American Presbyterian Church at Chapel Hill, North Carolina in 1942. Now that's just an abbreviated list of where he was speaking. He also was speaking on the following topics. I think it's very important to recognize what it is he's speaking on. He's talking about, his topics are the religion of Jesus and the disinherited. Again, this is 1936, 1937, 1938. Remember Gandhi's challenge for him to implement nonviolence as a spiritual discipline. So he's making that case, and he's also making the case for the distinction between the religion of Jesus and American Christianity. So the religion of Jesus and the disinherited is one topic title. The modern implications of religion. That's a campus forum series that he delivers on colleges all over the United States. The two things that unite us, the quest for peace. Christian, who calls me Christian? The faith by which we live. The religion of Jesus and our modern times. And this was delivered at a conference on student leadership in colleges for Negroes. So you're getting African-American students and faculty and staff from all over the American South. And that was in 1937. Personal religion living, sources of power for Christian action, the significance of Jesus in the disinherited. So you've got the religion of Jesus in the disinherited and the significance. And now at University of Chicago, he spoke on what shall I do with my life? And before I go on, I just want to remind you that in the late 30s and in the 40s, these are going to be the students, the faculty, the people who are actually, he's laying the seeds. And so these people are soaking up Americans, both European Americans and African Americans and what will become their European American Christian allies and their European American Jewish allies are all being privy to what Thurman is preaching. And remember, when he goes there, he's not just speaking to the students, but he's befriending. Sometimes he's already friends with the faculty members who have invited him. And if he's not, he quickly becomes. So you see this mentoring is happening, not just with his African-American students on Howard University's campus, but now Thurman, after that Khyber Pass moment, has taken it upon himself to continue to mentor. And if you remember back to week 1, that expanding magnetic field, where he had that radical shift in his thinking, where he understood that his responsibility, his moral responsibility, was not just to Afro-America, but to humanity writ large. You now see him implementing this in this grueling and exhaustive touring that he's doing throughout North America. And I keep saying throughout North America because he's also zigzagging across Canada, speaking in New Brunswick and Toronto and all points in between, to colleges, on college campuses, and to the young Christian student movement there. Other topics include, and I love that topic, what shall I do with my life? He's telling them, he's giving them a great idea of what to do. Mysticism and social change, the religion of the disinherited, and our underlying spiritual unities. So that's all we have time for with this slide. I'd love to say so much more, but we've got to skip those notes because we are rapidly coming to the end of our time today. And so I'd like to end the class by looking at, we talked about Thurman in the classroom at Howard, and we talked about his tour to India, and we talked about him on the ground, sowing those seeds for civil rights activism, and especially for the spiritual discipline of that philosophy of nonviolence. But now I want to end with 3 case studies, just looking briefly at the, and in greater detail at 3 of Thurman's students. And we know about King, we'll talk about him, and we know about some of the bigger names, but we want to talk about people who had left a very gigantic footprint, but sometimes are not as well known. And so I'd like to start off with Pauli Murray, who lived from 1910 to 1985. And Pauli Murray studied with Thurman while a law student at Howard Law School. Pauli Murray would go on to become a civil rights activist, a women's rights activist. She coined the term Jane Crow along with Jim Crow, and said she was actually a victim of Jane Crow, and the first African-American priest within the Episcopalian Church. So Pauli Murray was lawyer, civil rights activist, legal scholar, theorist, advocate, and author. Pauli Murray was born in Baltimore to Agnes Fitzgerald and William Murray. Murray's mother died from cerebral hemorrhage when Murray was 3 years old. And Murray's father was a graduate of Howard University and became a teacher and then a principal in Baltimore public schools. William Murray was dealing with grief and unable to raise 6 children on his own. So Pauli Murray was sent back to Durham, North Carolina, to be raised by the aunt she had been named for, Pauline Fitzgerald, and Pauline Murray, and her grandparents, Robert Fitzgerald, who was a Union soldier, and Cornelia Fitzgerald, who was had been a former slave. 3 years after sending Pauli to Durham, Pauli's father, William Murray, was committed to Crownsville State Hospital for the Negro insane. And when Pauli was just 12 years old, her father was beaten to death by a European American guard in the hospital's basement. And Pauli says that this was really a defining moment in her life. Pauli was an excellent student, taught herself to read at age 5, graduated from high school at age 15, but was refused entry into the top choice, which was University of North Carolina's Chapel Hill, because of course they did not admit African Americans at this time. But Murray refused to be bounded by segregation and chose not to apply to any African-American universities in North Carolina. And their next choice was Columbia University, but Columbia did not admit women at the time. So Murray instead enrolled at the all-women's school, Hunter College in New York, and graduated in 1933 with a BA in English literature. So Pauli Murray would continue to push both Jim and Jane Crow boundaries. And in 1938, Murray moved back to North Carolina to take care of her aging aunts and attempted to enroll in a sociology graduate program at UNC Chapel Hill again, and of course, again, was denied. And Polly was angry because Polly had immediate relatives, ancestors who were European Americans who were graduates of Chapel Hill, and one who was on the board of trustees. And it really labored petition to be admitted into the school and pushed against the Jim Crow boundary, but was denied and was not successful. Polly and a friend were also arrested on a trip, an interstate bus trip going from New York to North Carolina, when they refused to move to the back of the bus. So you see Polly continuing to push boundaries of segregation. Polly moved back to New York in 1940 and began working for the Workers' Defense League. It was at this time that Polly wrote a letter to Franklin Roosevelt, accusing Franklin Roosevelt of saying that he didn't really have the right to fight against fascism abroad when he was not fighting against racism at home. Now, Franklin Roosevelt never responded to Polly's letter, but Eleanor Roosevelt did, and the two became friends. As part of her work for the Workers' Defense League, Murray delivered a speech in Richmond, Virginia, that was attended by Thurgood Marshall and another Howard University Law School professor named Leon Ransom. They were so impressed with the speech that Ransom immediately approached Murray and asked Murray to apply to Howard Law School, and said that if she got in, he would guarantee that Murray got a scholarship to attend, and he hoped to see her there. So Murray kind of ignores her ban on African-American institutions. She's admitted, she receives a scholarship, and she begins to as a student at Howard Law. And I want to point out that it was Murray's 1944 law school paper that actually provided the basis for constitutionally challenging the separate part of the separate but equal ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson. And this is a paper that Murray wrote in 1944. And of course, Brown versus Board was argued a decade later. And the lawyer that actually argued it was Murray's former seminar teacher. At Howard Law, Polly Murray also, of course, becomes a student of Howard Thurman, and they would have a lifelong friendship. And Polly Murray learned lessons there in that laboratory, that classroom that I've talked about, where Thurman was both spiritual mentor and guide, even more than instructor or traditional professor. And the lessons, Polly Murray credits Thurman with giving her lessons that would be with her for the rest of her career, especially being fully herself, the self that she found when she looked within, the self that she felt God called her to be. Polly Murray also struggled with the complexities of gender as presented in the church, and she struggled with her own sexuality. And indeed, many contemporary writers and film writers have discussed this at length and have hailed her as a pioneer of queer and other movements. Now, how did this show up, though, in Polly Murray's work as a person who was concerned with Christianity? When we think about Thurman's challenge, who calls me Christian and what should I be doing with a life? Polly Murray founded the ACLU's Women's Right Project. Murray was mentored as a youth by Mary Church Terrell, but she went on to become an inspiration to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who credits Murray with inspiring her to write the historic amicus brief in the 1971 Supreme Court case, Reed versus Reed, which recognized women as victims of sexual discrimination. According to Ginsburg, Murray authored the notes that Ginsburg used to craft her brief. So Murray is helping to distinguish the similarities between sex discrimination and race discrimination, and helping to create a basis for Ginsburg and others to establish sex discrimination as unconstitutional in America. Murray was also the co-founder of the National Organization for Women, became the first African-American female deputy attorney general in California, and the first African-American women associate at the firm Paul Weiss. Murray was a poet who authored several volumes critiquing American lynching, Jim and Jane Crow, and giving voice to the crushed hopes and the dreams of African Americans. In 1977, Murray was part of the first group of women in America to be ordained, and she was the first African American woman to do so. And Murray's Eucharist ordination occurred at the Chapel of the Cross in a space that was of unique significance. A Bible at the chapel there belonged to her grandmother, who had been born into slavery. The lectern at the pulpit where she was ordained had been given to the church by Mary Rutherford, who was the woman who owned Murray's grandmother. Murray had an autobiography called Song in a Weary Throat, an American pilgrimage, and this was published posthumously in 1987. And in 2012, Murray was sainted by the Episcopal Church. Murray's goal was the pursuit of, quote, human wholeness. And Pauli Murray is considered to be one of the most pivotal social justice activists of the 20th century, and her childhood home in Durham, North Carolina, has been designated as a National Historic Landmark. I did have a poem by Murray, but we don't have time for that. So we'll move on to James Farmer. James Farmer lived from 1920 to 1999. I'll try to get through this really quickly because we only have about 10 minutes or so. Thurman was a student of James Farmer was a student of Howard Thurman at Howard University School of Religion. So unlike Murray, who was in the law school, Farmer was actually in the School of Religion. And those quotes that we read by a student earlier who was describing what Thurman was like in the classroom, those quotes were given by James Farmer in his autobiography. Farmer was born in Marshall, Texas. Both of his parents were educators. So we're seeing that trend, like after out of slavery, the next generation wants to secure that freedom to be responsible for their lives and getting the education, establishing educational institutions and religious institutions are primary upon these goals. And we see how it bears fruits with people like James Farmer, with people like Pauli Murray, with people like Howard Thurman and others. But back to Farmer, who was Thurman's student, he enters the Howard University Divinity School in 1938. After completing his BA, he was also a precocious child who entered college early. He was invited to the White House at age 21 by Franklin Roosevelt. And he was also a conscientious objector to World War II. James Farmer was a pacifist. And although James Farmer is a lot more well-known, I still wanted to bring him up because he was a pacifist and he was also a member of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Thurman would become a national board member and the first African-American member of the national board for the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And so he continued to mentor Farmer even after Farmer left Howard University's Divinity School and kept in close touch with him. In fact, Thurman encouraged James Farmer to establish or create or found the Congress of Racial Equality, which Farmer did in 1942 in Chicago. Farmer was also the initiator and organizer of the very first Freedom Ride in 1961. And so we can see how Thurman, as Thurman's student and as Thurman's mentee, Farmer is committed to applying spiritual discipline tactics to end segregation. And I think Farmer even said at some point in the autobiography or somewhere else that he never really did anything as far as the modern civil rights movement was concerned without checking in with Howard Thurman. So we really can see through these students that lived example of Thurman as a moral anchor and a mentor to these civil rights leaders. A little bit more on Farmer. He became National Secretary for the Student League for Industrial Democracies during the 1950s. He had a short marriage to his first wife, Christy, which ended in divorce, and then his second marriage to Lula Peterson. He worked for the NAACP. In addition to being the co-founder and director of CORE, he was later re-elected as the national director of CORE. And he also coined the name the Freedom Ride. And for anyone who may not be familiar with the Freedom Rides, this was the name for the interracial group that tested much in the same way that Pauli Murray did with her friend that a decade earlier, that tested integrate segregation laws by defying them in travel from the North to the segregated South and refusing to move. And again, here in the Freedom Rides, we can see that this is a direct implementation of the spiritual discipline of the philosophy of nonviolence that Thurman and others had gained from Gandhi. And you can see Thurman here implementing it, or his students implementing it. And I think it's safe to say that in regards to Thurman's challenge, who will be the Negro Gandhi, that Thurman is definitely paving the way for that, if not part of that movement. CORE is one of the, James Farmer is one of the big six of the civil rights movement. He helped to organize the March on Washington in 1963, as well as the Poor People's Campaign. He ran for Congress in 1968. He did lose to Shirley Chisholm. He was appointed Assistant Secretary to the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare by Richard Nixon, but he resigned a year later in frustration. He was a signer of the Human Manifesto II in 1973, and he co-founded the Fund for an Open Society. James Farmer lived the last few years of his life as a professor teaching at Mary Washington College from 1984 to 1988. And he died in 1989. And he published his biography, Lay Bare the Heart, in 1985. So again, this is James Farmer, one of Thurman's students. And we've got like 5 minutes. We get to finally our last. Just as Thurman had students who were active and are well known for their leadership on a national level, Thurman inspired a generation of students who did the same on a local level and a national level, but may have been lesser known. One of them is Jefferson Rogers, who lived from 1917 to 2014. And he was a student of Howard Thurman's at Howard University School of Religion in the I think that should be 1940. He started at the School of Religion. He was welcomed. Jefferson Rogers was born in Quincy, Florida. He was mentored. He graduated from Florida A&M, and he actually was mentored by Benjamin Mays, who was president of Morehouse College at this time. Benjamin Mays arranged for Jefferson Rogers to study with Howard Thurman at the Howard University Divinity School. And he also, Benjamin Mays, remember that I talked about these three together and the work they were doing. So Jefferson Rogers is also an example of those young, bright African Americans that they were looking to bring into the church as part of the effort to reform the church, African American church, and American Christianity. And we can truly see this in the career of Jeff Rogers. Benjamin Mays also wrote a letter to Jefferson Rogers' grandmother, who did not want him to leave state for school, and persuaded her to allow Jeff to attend school on scholarship at Howard University. Under Thurman's tutelage, Rogers would flourish, earn a master's degree in religion and philosophy, and take up his first position as director of Christian education at New Tabernacle AME Church in Philadelphia with his new bride, Mary Grace. While in Philadelphia, Jeff and Mary both decided to continue their education at Yale University, where Mary Grace picked up a master's in sociology, and Thurman had sent Jeff to study under his buddy Reinhold Niebuhr at Yale's Divinity School. Following this, Rogers became the first race relations secretary for the Evangelical and Reformed Church in Cleveland, Ohio. And then in 1953, Reverend Rogers took a position as pastor of Plymouth Congregational Church in Washington, D.C. And it is here that he earned a reputation as a scholarly minister, as an intellect whose sermons were intellectually and spiritually charged. And his lectures drew visitors both locally and nationally. Thurman's influence can be seen in Jeff Rogers' worship services, which integrated musicians across genres and promoted a robust cultural and intellectual program to church members and members of the general public. In Washington, D.C., Rogers became a member of the National Board of SCLC with Walter Fauntroy. And in D.C., Reverend Rogers' home was often, quote, a center for strategy sessions with Martin Luther King, Andrew Young, Wyatt T. Walker, Jesse Jackson, and other leading members of the civil rights movement. Rogers was the founding pastor of the Church of the Redeemer in 1958, where he continued to expand the programs established by him at earlier pastorages. When James Foreman, not to be confused with James Farmer, demanded reparations so famously at the Riverside Church in New York, many of the churches collectively gave money to a group of African-American churches. And that group of African-American churches became the Black Ecumenical Commission. Reverend Rogers became the first president and the executive minister for the Black Ecumenical Commission in Boston, Massachusetts in 1970. Rogers founded the Black Church Journal, and he brought on its first editor, Dr. Gaylord Wilmore. In 1972, Reverend Rogers was appointed the first African-American pastor of the interracial church, Hollis Presbyterian Church in New York. And Reverend Rogers would continue to do this work. And I think in his appointments, you can see him truly establishing the type of churches and Christianity and spiritual communities that Thurman had been so adamant about. And we'll see Thurman developing this more next class. After Reverend Rogers retired from there, he began teaching at Florida Memorial College during the late 1980s, where he brought on Arthur Ashe, the tennis player. He got Arthur Ashe to write a 3-volume series on the African-American athlete. It may have been the first of its kind. And Arthur Ashe also worked with Jeff Rogers and others to form the nonprofit New Birth Corporation. And New Birth also is really one of those geniuses that come out of this new milieu, this reformed Christianity, this reformed spirituality that Thurman and Mays and Johnson were a part of bringing into fruition. New Birth Corporation, led by Jeff Rogers, actually saved Howard Thurman's childhood home that you saw in class 1, and that famous live oak tree, which is still standing. They saved it from being demolished in the 80s, and Reverend Rogers put his own personal money into helping to renovate that. And the home is open to the public for tours and visitation in Daytona Beach, Florida today. If anyone's in Daytona Beach ever, I encourage you to go and visit it. And between 1966 and 2011, Reverend Rogers established the Howard Thurman Distinguished Lecture Series in partnership with Stetson University in DeLand, Florida, which was just 25 miles away from Thurman's boyhood home in Daytona Beach, Florida. I think we just finished. Those last 3 case studies were given to give you a kind of tangible illustration of how Thurman's students, and remember, each one of them represents dozens, if not hundreds, of men and women across the country, African-American and European-American, affected by Reverend Dr. Howard Thurman, and who would go on to really put into motion the modern civil rights movement. And also, by the way, Jefferson Rogers is my grandfather as well. A little bit of trivia I should share with everyone. So finally, I have one last thing that we don't have time for, but I do encourage everyone to spend some time thinking about this before next week. And I will read this and then close the screen. And if anyone wants to stay on for questions, they're welcome to do so. But Thurman said it became imperative now to find out if experiences of spiritual unity among people could be more compelling than the experiences which divide them. ICJS says, to dismantle religious bias and bigotry, we build learning communities where religious difference becomes a powerful force for good. So what I'm asking people to do between now and next week is to consider Thurman's search for spiritual unity and ICJS's mission and reflect on the following question. How can you find spiritual unity with someone religiously different from you? Thank you. And that's all we have time for today. And I hope to see everyone back next week.